Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's not looking good for Sergio Perez's future at Red Bull Racing, with rumours emerging today and reports from Red Bull themselves that Yuki Tsunoda is back in the frame for a drive alongside Max Verstappen next year. The theory seems to be they rate Yuki, they rate Liam Lawson. The winner of those two, if they prove to be emphatically so from now to the end of the season, is in serious conversation to get the drive alongside Max next year. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. What has actually changed here, given that Yuki didn't seem to be in the conversation a few weeks ago? Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Plenty as ever to get into. Mugello and elsewhere, there have been some tyre tests either done or planned. And for example, the 2026 tyres, we've actually seen, I think, the McLarens testing out those tyres over the last couple of days. Pretty interesting to see, but of course, the Ferraris, the Red Bulls, they've been doing laps of Mugello to test out next year's Pirelli tyre compounds. And then I think the McLaren were doing some laps on the 2026 spec, which is slightly smaller than what they presently have. There was a bit of talk as to whether, okay, Ferrari brought a new front wing to Singapore. Could they maybe do some testing on that to see whether they can extract a bit more from that package when they go to Austin? Then again, Austin, there's a new upgrade on the way anyway. And De Kessa basically says, look, the weakness in Singapore was quality. You can't really test that in a Pirelli tyre test. You're just doing lap after lap after lap, not necessarily pushing things 100%. There was also an interesting statement here from Oscar Piastri. We know that from now to the end of the season, if Lando is going to win the championship, he will almost certainly require some help from Piastri at some point. It's help that, to be fair, Norris has given Piastri at part of the seasons, and we have seen come back the other way as well at times, but not always the case. And there's certainly an argument to be made that if McLaren had handled things differently, Hungary, Monza, etc., this championship standings would look rather different, with where Max and Lando currently stand with a 52-point deficit that Lando still has, with 6 races and 3 sprints still to go. And Piastri says, look, he doesn't want to give up championship position or even race position, obviously, but he will do so if it is necessitated. If I'm only thinking about myself, I don't like team orders against me. No driver likes that. For your pride, you want to show that you are the fastest driver on the track. Nevertheless, I will help Lando in the final races if I am asked to. He has the more realistic chance of winning the title, but that is not a blank check. It has to make sense for me to let him by. So, yeah, Piastri is pretty clear on this, and it makes sense given his relationship with Mark Webber and his experiences, for example, at Red Bull alongside Sebastian Vettel, that Piastri, sure, if the team tells him to, and whatever happens behind the scenes in the meetings, then he will yield, but he will only yield if the situation kind of necessitates. If he is 20 seconds down the road, he's not going to slow down 20 seconds to let Lando pass. It's like, look, Lando, if you're in position to overtake and it makes sense in that particular moment, and basically they've said, we will justify it on a case-by-case basis. And look, they probably should have done a better job of this earlier in the season, and I do think they will regret some of their decisions, McLaren, when the season is over, but, you know, we don't know as of yet who's going to win this championship still. Piastri also says, we also want to win the Constructors, and sacrificing my race to help Lando won't help us achieve that goal, which I guess is true, but then again, you'd think McLaren, as it stands, are pretty much nailed on for the Constructors. It's obviously not at all guaranteed, but they're, you know, 85–90% likely to win it, I would say, at this point, McLaren, based on what we have seen in recent times. So, you know, theoretically, they probably could afford to sacrifice Piastri's race to help Lando, but of course, that's not what he wants, and that's probably not what they'll look to do. And as he says, Baku showed how we do things at McLaren, and fair enough to Piastri admitting that, yeah, his win in Baku, while helped largely by a semi-illegal rear wing that was maybe flexing a bit too much, as we talked about, but also Lando, by holding up Perez for a lap or so before the pit stop, definitely did help Piastri get that win at the end of the day. And he says, look, Lando has a share there in my victory. So Piastri will, I'm sure, look to help Lando out at some point, but exactly the circumstances of that type of discussion still remain to be seen, what McLaren may or may not do. This is pretty interesting as well. Jonathan Noble puts out an article at Motorsport just trying to kind of unpack what exactly happens this season for Max to go from winning by miles in every race apart from Australia before China, and Australia maybe he wins apart from the brake issue that he had, and obviously the fact that he had the brake issue, that raised further questions on this whole asymmetric braking stuff. But Look, Jonathan Noble goes into some detail here on exactly what may have happened or may not have happened, and some of the working theories around it, and his conclusion basically is, we still don't really know, and it's just an incredible turn of events that the performance advantage that Red Bull had seems to have disappeared, and look, some would argue that, well, maybe Red Bull's car is the same as it was, it's just other cars improved. I'm not sure the data implies that, and I'm also not sure that Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez's words imply that. Like, and even just watching the car, it looks noticeably more challenging to handle than it did at the start of the season. There can be many reasons for this, of course. I will say this is still, to me, quite a fascinating quote here from Christian Horner. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. I think he mentioned this a while ago, but I just wanted to share it again. If you were a skeptic, Horner says, you would say that something has changed because we went from winning races at a canter. I was getting grief from Stefano Domenicali at Formula 1 every weekend that the TV figures are dwindling because we're set for another year of Verstappen and Red Bull dominance. There was a lot of pressure coming saying, stop winning races by 20 seconds. So the FIA, or the Formula 1, let's say, are making it quite clear to Red Bull that they weren't happy that they were winning everything, but Horner and Max are going to say, well, what do you want us to do? This is Formula 1 at the end of the day. And then all of a sudden, shortly after that being said, you know, Red Bull stopped winning everything, and Max hasn't won now in so many rounds. It's very difficult to believe given where we were at the start of the season and last year. And Horner then said, if one was a skeptic and paranoid, you'd say something has changed, because even when we've gone back to the configuration of the car that we had in China, we still have some of the same issues experienced. But he says that maybe it changed for everyone, but I've never seen in a season a swing so exaggerated. And I think this is the point, really, of like where we started the year to where we are now. And maybe in Austin, Red Bull bring an upgrade, they got on top of things and there's no real questions. But it's just like we've never seen something like this, and it deserves some sort of explanation. And even, you know, the likes of Jonathan Noble, they're just not really sure what it is. So of course at the time we talked about when the rumours started to emerge, this whole asymmetric braking stuff, but the FIA said there was nothing like that was happening, and rival teams apparently don't think there was anything like that going on, despite the fact that the first guy to mention it said that he'd heard rumours in the paddock. Whatever, we just don't know. Then Noble says, all right, well, maybe there's some other theories around it. Of course, Newey's departure is one of them, but like, just because Newey says I'm going in Miami doesn't mean that the car's immediately going to be broken, does it? I mean, surely not. It would obviously have an impact in the longer term, but like he can't be literally holding the car together. So there is that. And then Noble kind of mentions, what if there was a change of the tyre construction that happened in Miami that would maybe offer a stronger front end for teams and would potentially introduce balance problems for a car like Red Bull? It's interesting, but basically Pirelli say, no, we haven't done anything like that. And such a change is actually just outlawed in the technical regulations. So, you know, the compounds have to be set in stone, basically. And that's pretty much what they're going on to say. And then there was some discussion on like minimum tyre pressures and whether there's any other reasons that this could potentially had an impact on. Like Pirelli laughed off these ideas. So the conclusion is basically still, we just don't really know what the answer is. Pirelli say there's nothing going on. Of course, aerodynamically, the car definitely seems to be weaker, and you know, Red Bull have made a couple of changes to the car, but then they say, well, from a correlation perspective, we're not quite getting it anymore. So it is still confusing exactly what or, you know, how this has happened, but I just think this sentence is still interesting, isn't it? That Horner basically admits that Formula 1 were telling them to slow down because it was damaging the sport, and then shortly afterwards, magically, they've slowed down. So, you know, whether that's a word from someone at Formula 1 to the FIA to make a change that maybe people don't know about, I don't know. But it's just like, look, there's conspiracies and then there's coincidences. And it's a pretty big coincidence in many respects what happens this season. Let's talk about the driver lineups though, because where is Liam Lawson, among others, potentially going to land? There are 2 seats still available, and maybe more than that as well, because as yet, RB have not locked down Liam Lawson. This, when they announced Lawson instead of Ricciardo, it was kind of assumed that, okay, Lawson's getting the final 6 races this season and then next season, but he's not necessarily anyway. They've not yet decided who gets that drive. Sauber is between most likely Bottas, then Colapinto, another big option of course, and then even Bortoletto as maybe like the more outside chance of that drive. But Liam Lawson will be in the car from Austin, and he was driving the Red Bull well, this past couple of days, he put in, I believe, 116 laps in the RB20, so pretty valuable stuff. And yeah, the fact that Lawson was testing the Red Bull car, not the RB, but it was the Red Bull there, the RB20, and Lawson was in the car, I'm sure that there were people at Red Bull having a look at some of the data, analysing some of the times, and, you know, just even from like a consistency point of view, right, that sure, you're not going to get a great deal of information because it's a brand new tyre test, you don't really know what the construction's like and how you compare that to another driver, but just like, you know, consistency of pace, these other factors, Lawson's ability to manage the tyres, like I'm sure you can take some information away from that, certainly over 116 laps or so of Magellan. So it raises the question, are Red Bull setting Lawson up to take Perez's drive? We know that Helmut Marko, if he got a choice, he would get rid of Perez immediately. Horner and maybe Red Bull from a money financial perspective want to keep hold of Perez, but even in recent weeks, Horner has been less convinced that Perez is going to be able to maintain the drive in what he said publicly, and I imagine that remains true for the Perez camp as well, even though he said that he ain't going anywhere. Well, not by his own choice is the implication there. So F1 Insider today put an article together, and usually I say take these guys a bit of a grain of salt, and that's fair enough, but actually they're just quoting Mr. Helmut Marko, Dr. Helmut Marko actually, and what he had to say, because the rumour has it that, yeah, Tsunoda is a legitimate threat. So Perez has to worry about this situation. Now he's back in the race, that is Yuki, for the coveted Red Bull cockpit alongside Max Verstappen. We're talking about Tsunoda. Chief advisor Helmut Marko told F1Insider.com Tsunoda is a candidate to drive alongside Max in 25. The remaining races of this season will decide what our driver pairings look like for next year. So anything still remains possible. There is basically going to be a shootout. There are 6 rounds and 3 sprint rounds to see Lawson and Yuki who is going to come out on top, and whoever does, if they do well enough, and if Perez doesn't really deliver in the Red Bull, then it's pretty likely that someone is going to get inside. And Marko actually mentioned the other day that we saw, I can very well imagine that a junior driver will drive alongside Max. So that's certainly what he wants. We decided to compare Lawson and Tsunoda. They have the same material, the same conditions, and each now has 6 races to prove that he is the better driver. So, I mean, look, this is the Red Bull way and is probably a way that's going to work out rather well. But it is very interesting that Tsunoda, for whatever reason, just hasn't been in the conversation. He's just been blacklisted, it seems, from even getting in the mix. And he has effectively become the benchmark for other drivers coming in. Ricciardo was expected to beat Yuki and beat Yuki comfortably, and if he did, he would earn the right at the Red Bull drive. He didn't, so he's not. But just because Tsunoda dispatched of Ricciardo, another teammate that Yuki has dispatched of over the last couple of years in some sense, then Yuki's not getting the opportunity at the drive. And obviously Anthony Davidson says, look, Tsunoda has beaten De Vries, beaten Daniel Ricciardo. That can't be a coincidence. And of course, Tsunoda, like from a mentality perspective, is different to many other drivers. He wouldn't be, he wouldn't be a happy second driver, that's sure. But he wouldn't be, well, Anthony Davidson doesn't reckon he would be mentally destroyed by Max like the others. He is an indestructible character. And I'm kind of incentivized to believe there might be some truth to that as well. So it's difficult because Horner seems to want probably no Yuki, maybe still Perez, maybe Lawson, I don't know. Definitely Marko wants Perez gone and one of Yuki or Lawson in the car. And it's a good opportunity for Yuki because I think Red Bull have come to the realization that actually Yuki is pretty damn good, as is Lawson. They had a couple of races alongside each other last year where Yuki generally came out on top, but it was Lawson's first time in the car pretty much. This year will be more of a level playing field, and I feel like they rate both drivers reasonably well, but I still believe someone is going to have to dominate the other in order for them to get the drive. My feeling is that, let's say Yuki and Lawson, they both do a solid job, they average a similar placing, maybe Yuki is slightly higher, like he averages, let's say 11th in quali rather than 12th or whatever, right, and averages a few more points per round. It won't be many given the current standings and the competitiveness of the sport, but you know what I mean. I think if Yuki or Lawson marginally defeats the other, I don't know if that's going to be enough. They may just say, well, Perez can stay, we're getting the money from the Mexican sponsors, whatever. But if one of them kind of dramatically outperforms the other from now to the end of the year, I think that will be a good sign that actually they are seriously legit, because if you can outperform Tsunoda comfortably, you're a pretty damn good driver, and I think the same is probably true for Yuki if he was to dispatch of Lawson. So I think that's what Red Bull are going to have to see if they are going to make a decision like this. And if I had to guess what will happen between Tsunoda and Lawson, I'd say it'll be pretty competitive, and I would probably tip the scales in the favour of Yuki marginally, but I don't know if that's going to be good enough to get in the drive, especially because he's had opportunities in the past and he's been the most promising of their drivers for many a year. But for whatever reason, he's just not a driver that's been massively considered, whether it's just to appease Honda or whatever. They don't rate his mentality. You know, these are questions that have been raised. But I'm intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below, because Racing News 365 actually asked loads of fans, and they got about 2,000 votes in this poll on where Lawson is going to drive next year, and over half of respondents voted for Red Bull. So, you know, it seems like basically half of the community believe that Lawson will do well enough to get promoted to Red Bull next year. Pretty much the other half reckon that he's going to stay at RB, and then there's about 10%, it seems, that predicts that he's not going to do well against Yuki. They're going to promote Yuki, presumably, or whatever, or Lawson's not going to stay, and they're going to sign Colapinto or somebody instead if Lawson doesn't prove to be the guy that they need. So very much intrigued to your predictions on that in the comments below. Just an interesting note on Mercedes as well. You guys remember when they put Mercedes, Kimi Antonelli in the car for Monza, and he took George Russell's car out for a couple of laps. He did a flying lap. He was set to go P1 by an absolute mile on his second lap, but he just overheated the rear tyres, and going into the parabolica, he lost the rear, spins out, crashes into the wall, and it wasn't, you know, exactly a great start for Antonelli. My feeling was pretty optimistic after that, because, you know, a driver that's confident enough to get out there in his first session and basically just send it and eventually crash. Like, I think that's a driver that's very exciting for the sport, be that good or bad. But like, Mercedes obviously wasn't ideal. Mercedes didn't want Antonelli to crash the car. They did seem to want him to put down a marker. Like, the fact that Antonelli went out there and was just flying on his first couple of runs, and he was pushing harder on his first couple of runs than Hamilton did the entire session, even with the track rubbering up towards the ends. So, you know, that was exciting to see him in action. Hopefully we get him again at some FP1 session from now to the end of the season as well. But it obviously wasn't optimal for Mercedes. It was kind of a bad look for them, kind of a bad look for Antonelli. And Wolf can say, well, he was insanely fast before he crashed. Wasn't exactly the ideal scenario. So Toto does say that in hindsight, maybe they could have done something differently, but he says, I wouldn't say it was a mistake, but I think we weren't completely right in assessing the pressures that he could find himself under, because, you know, home Grand Prix for an Italian driver coming in to replace Lewis Hamilton, like, there is pressure there, and, you know, clearly it went a bit too far. We talked about how to approach the session. He's been brilliant in testing, but it's a different ball game if you're an Italian driver, 18 years old in Monza, and it's your first opportunity. Maybe if we'd consider that as a risk factor against the set of data we had from him, probably it would have been wise to give him an FP1 that would have been a totally different time zone than Italy, but he will learn a lot from that regardless. So Mercedes kind of admitting their error, kind of saying that actually in the long term it might turn out to be a good thing regardless, but very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments. Just one final piece. The FIA, they have a couple of new senior leadership appointments, so well done. They're finally strengthening their team under Ben Sulayem. Of course, worth remembering that it was only a few days ago that 2 senior leadership members resigned from the organisation, right? So it's not like magically, you know, the organisation's getting back on track and they're solving their problems. There is, yeah, clearly more to it than that. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.